This week on the Marketplace of Ideas, a conversation about the nonfiction cinema of Errol Morris with journalist and curator Livia Bloom, editor of the new book, Errol Morris Interviews. It's the Marketplace of Ideas. I'm Colin Marshall. Livia Bloom is a cinematic curator and journalist. She's written for such publications as Filmmaker magazine and CinemaScope, and she's edited a new book of conversations with the nonfiction director behind such films as Gates of Heaven, Mr. Death, and The Thin Blue Line. It's Errol Morris Interviews. Livia, welcome to the program.
Thanks so much, Colin.
You open the book with a description of how you came to know Errol Morris, or came to know who he was, and sort of retroactively figure out what you'd seen of his. Could you set the scene a little bit as to the circumstances of that first interview you conducted with him that is included in this book? So
I was in Cannes in 2002, and I was meeting with my editor of a small publication when suddenly the door opened and in burst one of her other writers with the news that there was no one to interview Errol Morris the next morning in just a few hours. And she turned to me and said, "Would you do it?" And I said, "Of course, yes." And then I walked out of the office and just panicked immediately because I just had no idea who he was and didn't know anything about him. And suddenly I was going to be interviewing him. It was my very first interview that I had ever done. And so I was completely petrified. So I immediately contacted, everyone that I knew in the film world, anyone who might know. And this was in 2002, so it was for the film The Fog of War, which was premiering out of competition in kind of a secret screening that hadn't been announced. So no one really knew that it was there. And I quickly contacted not only film people, but also anyone that I knew who might know about Robert McNamara, and, could give me some background. And, despite the time difference of 6 hours, I just called everyone and emailed everyone and tried to find out how to prepare myself for this interview. And as it turned out, slowly, as I started to, receive these responses from everyone from, a friend who was an archivist to my parents who knew about McNamara, I started to realize that I actually knew more about Morris than I had realized at first. That in physics class in high school, our teacher had shown us Brief History of Time, Errol's film, with the physicist Stephen Hawking, and I realized that I had seen Fast, Cheap, and Out of Control, and slowly I realized that the situation was a little bit less dire than first expected. So the next day, I stayed up all night studying him and reading all about him, and just was working as hard as I could. And the next day, I went to meet him, and I was there with a cameraman, and it turned out that I was not the only person interviewing Errol. It turned out there were about 50 journalists lined up to interview him in the Carlton Hotel with this long line out the door of the suite, and everyone would have just 10 minutes. And of course, I had been working all night, and I had about 40 questions that I wanted to ask. So I try to whittle them down, and
I have to say this shows admirable resolve, because as a journalist as well, if I have a publicist say you're going to get 10 minutes with somebody, I just go away. I mean, there's no remaining there for me. So at least you stuck it out.
Yeah. Well, it was my first interview, and I had just been preparing, really intensely. So I don't even think that occurred to me. I was also on assignment, so I didn't really have an option of leaving. Anyway, I went in with my cameraman who had been sent along to accompany me, and started speaking with him. And I had, my perfect questions all ready to go. And as soon as I started to speak to him, I said, "So nice to meet you. And my first question is," and he just interrupted me and said, "Oh, you say you like the film. Why do you like the film?" And just immediately turned the tables, went on the offensive, and confronted me. I was prepared for maybe everything except that. And just it stopped me dead in my tracks. I said, well, could I tell you afterward? He said, no, I need to know now. And so I, stumbled out some answer, which thankfully he seemed to find adequate. And we went on from there. And it was just such an interesting and stimulating conversation that I, remained, follow over his work over the subsequent years. And whenever he would have a new film after that, I arranged to interview him. And I went back and, read many of his other works, his other interviews, and saw all of his other films. So when the opportunity for the book presented itself, that was such a clear choice to me. It was the first interview I did, and it really got me hooked on interviewing in general.
And this interview we've been talking about, of course, it's included in the book, as well as another one you conducted with him for the newer movie, A Standard Operating Procedure. And
yes.
I was thinking this whole image of a press junket with Errol Morris sitting there and interviewing 50 people, or being interviewed by 50 people in a row. I think to myself, a guy with the sort of intellectual curiosity that you see revealed in this book of interviews, that must be quite hellish for him to have to sit there and just have and I say this as a journalist to another journalist. It must really suck to be in Errol Morris's position. He must have seen something in what you did or said that told him, well, this is going to be something a little different.
Well, I should say that after about 5 minutes, we really kind of hit it off. And he wound up extending the interview. A publicist would come in and say, you have to end, and he would say no.
I love that.
This is a good conversation. I'm not going to end, and really put his foot down. And we wound up talking for almost an hour. But I actually think that Errol loves to be interviewed. He's not only a master interviewer, where he, in The Fog of War, for instance, you see moments where Robert McNamara, admits to seeing himself in some senses as a war criminal, and this kind of amazing footage. But he also really loves to talk about his work. He's incredibly articulate and funny. And I think in some ways, although he also does write, Errol, I think in some ways being interviewed is his way of writing as well. If you think about critics from the French New Wave like Jean-Luc Godard or François Truffaut, who not only practiced filmmaking but also wrote extensively about filmmaking. I think that by reading Errol's interviews, you get a sense of his philosophy in a way that's not dissimilar from those filmmakers' words.
It's one of the fascinating things about this form of book, and there's similar books that exist on other filmmakers. I was reading one with Peter Greenaway as well recently, and I noticed the same phenomenon with the two books, that when you read a series of interviews conducted over time with a filmmaker, they do repeat themselves, and I like it better when the editors of the book don't take out the repetition, because you get to see the same ideas re-articulated many times, sometimes, but they slowly evolve with each one, and you can kind of see how their mind works in a way over a longer span of time. Now, was this something you knew would emerge from the book before you even had it assembled, or was this emergent to you as well when you were reading over what you had?
That's an interesting question, and it's one that came up even in that very first interview with Errol, because when I was researching Robert McNamara and his interviews, I found that he had told many of the same stories that he told to Errol to many other people in the past. So while there were aspects of his interviews with Errol in The Fog of War that he had never said before, there were also many stories that he had told time and time again, including a story that he had told, a story about sort of the moment at which he became politicized, that he had told even to the same conference over different years. And so I think that those themes inevitably come up. And as you say, it does give you a window into the moments that are significant, and that these questions that an individual continues to push at and continues to be in conflict with and continues to to sort of unpack through the course of their work and their careers. So with Errol, for instance, frequently he's telling stories and questioning, for instance, truth and the relativity or absolutism of truth, and so that's sort of not only an obsession, but it's sort of a personal line of inquiry that just doesn't stop with him.
That does bring up one theme that I noticed in the book, and by theme I mean actually literally a repeated phrase that happens, 7 or 8 times throughout the course of the book, where he says, "The truth is not up for grabs." Now, what does that mean to you?
The truth is not up for grabs is a phrase that to him makes a lot of sense just on its face value. Either, for instance, in The Thin Blue Line, either one of the protagonists committed a murder or the other one did. I mean, there are simple facts about what happened or did not happen. At the same time, I think in a way the phrase might be reminding himself and reminding us as well about the ways that different individuals can come to see the facts of a truth that can be so different that it takes some reminding. For instance, in his most recent film, Standard Operating Procedure, you see many different, versions of the truth, and he tries to reconstruct, the facts of what happened in a way, taking into account how different perspectives of individuals can be.
It's a fascinating, I don't know if dichotomy is the right word here for what I'm trying to get at, but the fact that Errol Morris has such an interest in truth and a belief that what's true is true. There's an objective, true world out there that we can talk about. But then you put that with his filmmaking interests, and this was, being a fan of his for a long time, I'd never actually articulated this so much to myself, but he says he's interested in, and I'm going to paraphrase, he's interested in the false worlds people live in, and that's what he balances his interests in an actual truth with a total fascination with untruths that people surround themselves with. Is that, you think, a decent way of putting his intellectual interests there, or am I making this too simple?
No, I think that's a really good synthesis of what his project is. I think that he comes at some of these questions from lots of different perspectives and looks at them from different angles, or turns them upside down and inside out, and tries to sort of approach some of these questions from different perspectives. But ultimately, many filmmakers will tell you that, in a sense, many of all of their different films are part of a project that could be even conceived as one long film. And in a sense, that's definitely part of a grander theme of Errol's long film, if you will.
This identifiability of sort of a larger project in the filmography of Errol Morris, it's not something one can always find in a filmmaker. I know you interview many filmmakers. I've interviewed a few, but what's different, that and anything else, what's different about talking to Errol Morris, whether by your own experience or by the experience of reading these interviews and compiling them? What's different about talking to him than talking to other filmmakers?
Errol is an incredibly articulate and funny character. And in a way, as I said before, he's really not only a master interviewer, but he's a master interviewee. And I think that one of the reasons why the book interested me, and one of the reasons why I enjoy speaking with him so much, is because his interviews really stand on their own. If you have never seen an Errol Morris film, I think that this book would still stand up and would still be, very much of interest, or would still tell a story of someone, and a story of their intellectual, projects and struggle over a long period of time that would still hold up. So in that sense, I think he's really unusual, the way that he engages with these tough intellectual questions. He's had a very fraught relationship with academia over the course of his life. He was in, numerous grad programs that didn't work out. But at the same time, he was once described as kind of this eternal grad student. And in a way, I think that despite some of the sort of complicated, maybe sordid relationships that he's had with schools, he's constantly educating himself, and he's constantly thinking in these really interesting cycles and interesting patterns. So in a way that's really unusual, his intellectual curiosity is really unparalleled. It really stands out even after having interviewed many, many filmmakers. He was the first one that I spoke to, and he remains one of the most fascinating.
It's just occurred to me that as we talk about this, I'm an interviewer interviewing you, who is an interviewer, who has interviewed a filmmaker who is essentially an interviewer. I don't know what to make of that rabbit hole, that sort of vortex. But does that strike you as strange and meta as it strikes me?
Well, it's interesting because I've especially starting with Errol, I came to become really fascinated in interviewing as a practice itself. So Errol speaks at great length and over the course of his life about the very process of interviewing. So, for instance, he has a whole theory about what it is to be a good interviewer. He calls himself a proponent of the shut the up school of interviewing. So the shut the up school of interviewing is that starting in his very first interviews, where he was interviewing these convicted murderers on death row, he would bring his little tape recorder, and his goal was to record for as long as possible on one tape without hearing his own voice on the tape. So if he could get one tape where it was only the other person talking, to him that was an ideal interview. And through another theme that he sort of repeats and reminds himself throughout the course of his life and his interviews is that if he leaves people alone and if you let them talk, in just 2 or 3 minutes, they'll show you how crazy they really are. And and I think that he has a point. I mean, although I should add that it's very difficult to interview someone where that's their theory, of course, and that they are not only interviewing, responding to your questions, but judging you on the quality of your questions and the manner in which you ask them.
Did he do that to you, where he just kind of waited and let you say whatever you could fill the space with?
Well, actually, it would be the other way around.
Oh, okay.
I, would wait and try to let him fill the space, right? Because that was the role that he wasn't interviewing me, I was interviewing him. And so, of course, there are time constraints that make that method of interviewing a real luxury. It's also really effective. And actually, one thing that's interesting, Colin, and I don't know if you found this, is that if you do that, if you wait while the person, after they've finished, if you just wait and let there be this really brutally unpleasant pause, eventually they do start talking again because they feel sort of compelled to fill this space. And it's true, as Errol says, that often you can get, in that moment, you get material that you just never could have known to ask about, even if, no matter how well you prepared, which is sort of what it's all about in a way.
It seems most on display in the film Standard Operating Procedure, which I was actually watching that last night, and I noticed it's more distinct that that's what he's doing in that movie. You actually see the end of the answer, and then you see, for example, Lindy England sitting there for about 5-10 seconds, coming back with something else, sitting there for a while, coming back with something else, all in the same shot. It seemed as if, tell me if I'm right or wrong here, it seemed as if in the films before, he would do that while he was interviewing, but you wouldn't necessarily know as a viewer that he was just waiting it out and letting more information sort of drip forth while he didn't respond.
Well, Errol's worked with some incredible editors, and I think, and he's always, very, very involved in the editing process. But that's often an editing call. If you look at a film like Fast, Cheap, and Out of Control, the editors, there were two women, a variety of editors worked on the film, but two women who were most credited for it, Karen Schmier and Sandra Merrill, it was a really masterful job in terms of the editing.
Since we're both fans of Errol Morris and we both interview other people a lot, what else have you learned personally as far as interviewing skills from Errol Morris? And you can't have come away from this not having changed your technique at least a little bit. I know I have from reading the book and watching his movies. Or maybe you haven't.
Well, I think that my, such as it is, the way that I interview people was so much formed by my, ongoing relationship with Errol that it's a little bit difficult to distinguish the two. I mean, as soon as I started interviewing, it was about him, and it was about reading what he had done and frequently what he says about interviewing itself. So I think that for me, those are really entwined.
It's true. It's a good point you make, because I had forgotten, or I'd failed to think about the fact that, yes, that was the first one you did was with Errol Morris. So you were sort of forged as an interviewer in the Morris cauldron in a way.
That's right. And that was an interesting moment, because when we spoke that first time about the 504, that was before the 504 had won an Oscar. It was before it had been released. So it's interesting to see, in different times when I see him, perhaps a year or two apart, he might be in a different place. And that film, for instance, it was kind of an interesting moment, an opportunity to speak to him before his work was quite as well known as it is today.
And speaking of the extent to which Errol Morris is known or has been known, I want to return to the sort of run-up to that first interview you describe in the book, and you've just described in the conversation as well, that you had to send out a few emails and such asking for information about Errol Morris, and then realized, oh yeah, and it's that guy who did those movies like Fast, Cheap, and Out of Control, Brief History of Time. And I think that is not an uncommon experience for a lot of people. Even some who you would say the name Errol Morris to, and they're not quite sure who it is. You can rattle off a few films and they'll be like, oh yeah, that guy. And I find that doesn't happen with a lot of documentary filmmakers. Why is it different for Errol Morris, do you think? Typically when I bring up a documentary filmmaker and I say their name and then I even say the name of their films, I still get kind of a blank. But with Errol Morris, it's like, oh, him, yes, of course. How could I not know that?
His films are really distinct, and there are some qualities that return or recur over the course of different films, some technical aspects of them or techniques that really set them apart. So for instance, he frequently uses illustrations in his films, illustrations of what his subjects, his documentary subjects, might be talking about. So for instance, and that can really push the boundaries of what one might typically identify as a film in the documentary mode. So for instance, in Fast, Cheap, and Out of Control, it's a really subtle film and a really, I would say, underrated film, where Errol speaks with a lion tamer, a mole rat expert, a robotics scientist, and a topiary gardener. And he does these long interviews with each of these men. And the way that the film is put together, each of them sort of comes with, it's not simply footage of the individual. Each of them sort of is accompanied by archival footage, but not just archival footage, also footage from, say, the lion tamer is accompanied by sort of circus footage that Errol has acquired. And then initially, each of them, their voices, their image, and the accompanying imagery is sort of distinct, and each one has their own little realm. But as the film goes on, those are edited to sort of overlap, and it produces a new meaning about the commonalities between the characters that is really unique. So for instance, there's a moment that recurs to me that means a lot to me, or that I keep returning to myself, where, for instance, you hear a voice and it's a little unclear who's speaking, who says, I don't know who will carry on my work after my death. And it's actually the topiary gardener who's speaking at that moment. But the image that you see is from the group of images associated with the circus. And it's an image of a magician who is has produced a dove in a cage, and who opens the cage and lets the dove free. And so at the moment, while it's not specifically a moment documenting only the one individual's perspective, it becomes through the editing and the imagery a much larger sort of statement about questions that we all face, not even just this individual, or not even just all the individuals in the film. It becomes more about sort of a common human concern about death and about the continuation of our work. So, here on this earth. So I think that that's a really distinct quality that Errol's films have. While very academically and intellectually rigorous, they also have this sort of illustrative artistic component that shows itself in each work, and I think is really significant aspect of Errol's filmmaking.
I'm glad you used that movie as the example, because that is Fast, Cheap, and Out of Control is at least my personal favorite Errol Morris film, and it's filled with moments that I consider to be quintessentially Morrisian, or I don't know what the word is there, but quintessentially Errol Morris like. Speaking of, these themes, the themes in his films are the themes that appear in the interviews as well, and I want to know how much material did you have to sculpt this book out of? Are there hundreds of interviews you had to bring down to the essence of Errol Morris in these select ones, or are there not many more than these you've included? What's the situation as far as what's out there?
There's certainly more interviews than these, and Errol continues to conduct them every day. I did some pretty extensive research and selected these as representative, and I tried to cover each of his films and really get a good sampling from throughout his life, with people who had different perspectives. The pieces in the book are very different lengths, and the people who are interviewing him have different projects of their own. I think also that it's interesting to add that Errol's films, in some ways, are not only just intellectually rigorous, but they're also very inherently political to me, which is also something that interests me. You're speaking about interviewing, and I think that there is, perhaps not obviously, but to me, there is a really consistently political component to curating and interviewing. It's just yesterday, Howard Zinn passed away, and I was reminded of a moment when I heard him speak, and he was talking about, he gave a lecture up at Cornell, and then he was taking some questions afterwards, and he was asked by someone, there's so many of them, there's so few of us, it's just overwhelming, and how can we compete? How can we being, the progressives say, writ large is a shorthand word, but how can we ever compete, and how can even, let alone win? And Zinn said, one thing to remember is that the painters and the musicians and the writers and the filmmakers and the curators, they're all on our side. And I think that really stayed with me. And I think that in a sense, just by the selection of who you decide to talk to in your interviews, who you decide to privilege with that attention, how you juxtapose works in a film series or even different pieces in a book, I think it can be, in a sense, and perhaps in a subtle sense, an inherently political act.
Do you have any examples on hand of whether, in terms of selecting interviews for this book, or whether doing the cinematic curation work that you do, how the political has manifested itself in those endeavors?
So right now, as a curator, I've been really focused on documentary films, not just with the book on Errol, but doing a lot of film series up at the Maisels Cinema in Harlem, which is an all-documentary institute that Al Maisels founded. But in addition to documentary, I've done some work on other modes and genres of film. And so one example I might give is a series from 2007 that was about the horror film in the 1970s and in the contemporary world, or that was in the earlier part of the aughts. And so in a sense, not only to me was that an example of, seeing what some might consider to be low culture in a different, it was in a museum. And so it was in a more of a space that was reserved or assigned for high culture events, but it was also a way of taking seriously some work that isn't often taken seriously, and being honest about the impacts and what makes an impact and what speaks to national and international concerns and fears and nightmares, especially during times of war, whether it's Vietnam or Iraq in that case. And so I think that while at times, the act of curating or it's a pretty rarefied little space, but I think it has the potential to be a powerful and an important way of expressing a point of view. I also think that, in a sense, just for many years, that was the realm of a very white male kind of aesthetic, and that seeing that change over time, I think, is also inherently political in and of itself.
If you've just tuned in, this is The Marketplace of Ideas. I'm Colin Marshall. You can find our complete interview archive at colinmarshallradio.com, plus other fun stuff. My guest is Livia Bloom, cinematic curator and journalist, editor of the new book Errol Morris Interviews. Here's Livia Bloom reading a selection from one of her interviews with Errol Morris.
So here's a moment where he told me about this, and he had never told anyone about this story. So he explains. So first of all, you see his interest in the scientific and his own great research. I mean, Errol reads, like a house on fire. He's an avid reader. There are books everywhere when you see him and or visit him, and he's just a voracious student. So here he brings together the personal and the scientific in a really interesting way. He explains there are two, I'm reading from his interview. There are two terms, amblyopia and strabismus. Amblyopia refers to the suppression of vision, and strabismus is when the eyes are physically out of alignment. So cross-eyed, wall-eyed, that's strabismus. As a child, I was wall-eyed. I had the Jean-Paul Sartre problem. And I said, you do have the Jean-Paul Sartre problem. Meaning, of course, his existential angst. So we agreed on that and laughed. And he says, you don't completely understand this, but the idea is that if the eyes can't be physically brought into alignment, the brain is going to see two different images that it can't integrate. So it suppresses one of those images, usually the eye that's out of kilter. It's not physically out of kilter. It's a normal eye. It's just misaligned. In the 1950s, and I think still today, although I'm still researching this, they operated on the muscles of the eye to bring it back into position. Then they would put a patch on the good eye, forcing you to use the lazy eye. It encouraged the brain to get up to speed. My stepfather, Ben Easterman, was an ophthalmologist. He married my mom when I was 23 years old. In many ways, he was my dad, although I never called him my dad. He was a family eye doctor. I think he was always interested in my mom. That's what I think. He operated on my eyes when I was 2. I would call it the reverse Oedipus myth because he blinded me and married my mom. I would never wear my patch. I always tore my patch off. My eyes are aligned, but I don't have stereopic vision. The two eyes never integrated, and this left eye has always been very weak. I can barely read with it. I can see out of this eye, but I can barely read an E on the eye chart. There's a whole corpus of literature on whether vision can be restored to the eye. Most recent studies say yes, to a certain extent, but they used to say that if it hadn't developed by the age of 8 or 9, it would never develop, kind of like language acquisition. So when I was 3, shortly after my father died, I was operated on and my eyes were bandaged. While my eyes were bandaged, my mother came to visit me. My stepfather told her that she shouldn't say anything to me because I would be disturbed to know that she was there if I couldn't see her. So she came to visit me and said nothing. I've always wondered about the fact that my father dropped dead not so many months before, and my mother had vanished as well. What did that do? I think my stepfather should have let her talk to me. And then he adds, I'll skip one paragraph and then, go on to this conclusion where he says, most of the ways that people test for stereopsis are optical illusions, gimmicks, created by the fact that we have these two singular flat images on our retinas that are integrated to create the illusion of three-dimensionality. So say I go into a 3D movie, I can't appreciate it because in order to see it properly, you have to have the red and green glasses and you have to have stereopsis. If I go in, I just see a double image on the screen. But is the person who sees it with stereopsis seeing something that's veridical as opposed to me? An optical illusion of three-dimensionality is created for people who have this ability, whereas I cannot be tricked in this way.
And now back to our conversation. To follow that up, how important is it to you, for example, in the position of the curator, is it that an audience recognizes explicitly how films like these might be political? I say this, by the way, as somebody who consistently fails to find the political content in anything, not because I try not to find it, but because for some reason I often am the guy at the table who after seeing a movie just is the one that didn't get a lot of the political stuff that came across. So as a curator, how important is it to you to convey explicitly what is political about what the series of films someone might be seeing?
It's not important at all, in fact. And I think that it's, in fact, if you're paying too much attention to it, then you're probably doing something wrong. If, your viewers are paying too much attention to it, you may be doing something wrong. I mean, I think it's more a question of what you're suggesting has value. And so if you say, come to see, a film in a horror series at a museum, I think that that's already inherently political. You don't need to push it further. Of course, some people may look further and look into, more explicitly on their own. But I think that if you're thinking too much about it, then perhaps I've failed and it's too heavy-handed. I think it's got to be a much more subtle thing than that. If you even go into a museum or an art gallery, simply by what they've chosen to exhibit, who they're exhibiting and what the type of work is and how those pieces are juxtaposed in the space, that can be inherently a really political statement. I mean, for instance, perhaps this is a bit off topic from Errol, or perhaps not. There's a really interesting art curator that comes to my mind. His name is Fred Wilson, and he was given at one point the opportunity to curate an exhibit at any institution in the United States, and he chose the Maryland Historical Society, which is a very, as you might imagine, it's just a very conservative collection in a very conservative space. And so what he did was he mined their archive and their collection and did things like, had a display called metalwork, and in the display put everything from really incredible wrought silver dishes to chains that had been used to, restrain blacks during that time. So he found that there were no images of Native Americans. There were many in the collection. There were many sort of big wooden Indians that sculptures that sort of displayed stereotypes, but there were nothing documenting the existence of the contemporary Native American population in Maryland. And so a series of photographs were commissioned, and it was positioned so that the sculptures were looking at the new photographs and sort of looking into the future in that sense. And that's very, very explicit, but in terms of its political content, but I think that it makes the point about, and the space of the Maryland Historical Society being a very conservative space. I mean, if he had done the show in an edgy, avant-garde, white box gallery, it would have had a completely different context than it did in this really established sort of mansion. And I think that is a very extreme example of the ways that selection and juxtaposition can impact, viewers' perception and perception of artifacts and perception of work that they're taking a look at and studying and considering and thinking about. That's a really clear example, and there are more subtle ones too. But just by showcasing, by highlighting, by saying this is important and this is someone that you should take a listen to, or whose films you might want to take a look at, I think that that's suggestive of a larger artistic project and value and worldview.
And as we see politics like this in, for example, the cinema of Errol Morris, you mentioned earlier the political nature of his work, and I think especially if you look at his films of the 2000s, The Fog of War about Robert McNamara and Standard Operating Procedure about Abu Ghraib, I don't think anybody would deny that he's making work with political content. But at the same time, I suppose we have to draw a distinction, because you say documentary filmmaking, you say political, and people tend to think of, or at least sometimes my mind goes right to, sort of specific advocacy documentaries. And that calls to mind a style that I find very different from Errol Morris's. You can read in the interviews in this book, for example, that he will get completely diametrically opposed reactions to one of his movies that deal overtly with the political. For example, The Fog of War, he'll have people saying, you let McNamara off the hook, and he'll have people who think that he was hard on him. He'll have both sides of the coin. And you wouldn't find that in, say, a Michael Moore movie. You know where you don't have one person saying Michael Moore was too easy on a corporation, one saying he was too hard. What is the difference here in terms of how Errol Morris handles this subject matter?
That's a really good point. One thing that always amazes me about Errol's films is that although they're very, very heavily edited, and you very clearly see the hand of the director, from the music to the illustrations that are edited in throughout, to the style of the editing. Even intertitles are often used in some of the films, like The Fog of War. Despite all of that, it never ceases to amaze me the extent to which you're somehow also able to make up your own mind, or you leave with that impression that you can make up your own mind in any case when you walk out of one of Errol's films. And I think that that's one of the qualities that I respect so much about his work, that not only can he show you his own personality and his own take on the work to a certain extent, he also is really interested in the complexity, and it's really important to him that the subjects remain complex and do not become, oversimplified in his treatment of them. That said, in films like The Thin Blue Line, they're extremely convincing. I mean, that's a film where it's actually, a very famous example where because of the film, a man was exonerated from death row. I mean, it had a very tangible, real-world impact. But at the same time, he's able to he has a real talent for being able to sort of perhaps lead you in a direction without sort of oversimplifying his topic. And I think that viewers of his films really appreciate that about him.
Thin Blue Line is a good example because I like all his films. I like that one as well, of course. And I think about it, and I think about what it is, and the fact that this is really, if you read the way he talks about it in the book you've put together, he describes it as the most advocating of advocacy documentaries, because he believed that this man who was in jail on death row was not guilty, and he made this movie with it in his mind, I'm going to get this guy off of death row. I mean, I don't think even Michael Moore, to bring up the example I used before, is as clear about his goals in terms of why he's making a movie. At the same time, I think that shouldn't work in The Thin Blue Line. I think that those ingredients, that stance shouldn't make a good movie. And yet it somehow does, and I'm still trying to figure out what he did to make me like something that I thought I never could have liked. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, I mean, one thing about Errol, while he's very firmly associated with the documentary mode of cinema, he would note, I think, and I would certainly note, that all genres and modes have an equal capacity for greatness, and that the boundaries between those genres and modes are often collapsed and conflated. So, for instance, in that film, while of course it belongs firmly in the documentary mode, it also is a horror film, and it also is a detective story, and it also is a courtroom drama, and it also is a really beautiful series of portraits. And so I think that I might offer that as a possible reason why you had a different response to it than you might have to, another technique that would have accomplished a similar goal. But I think that also his way of making his argument, of leading people in that sense to his conclusion, and he does ultimately get a confession. So that's, an example, I would say, where he uncovers an ultimate truth. I mean, by the time he gets the confession and all the evidence is pointing in a particular direction, he seems to have, uncovered a certain truth that's pretty difficult to dispute. That said, I think that it's in many ways his familiarity with and his use of a lot of other different genres and modes that some that he pioneers and some that he evokes, that make the film as powerful and as entertaining as it is.
Since we're talking The Thin Blue Line, I have to ask you this. I was reading just the other day a letter recently put on the internet from 1988, Harvey Weinstein of Miramax fame, writing to Errol Morris saying, "Heard you on NPR the other day. You were boring. Cut the legalese. Nobody's going to want to see this movie. I don't want to see it. Hearing you talk. Give me a one-line description. Say it's in cold blood, but funny." And what did you think of that letter?
And I think he goes on to say, if you don't do this, I'm going to hire an actor to play Errol Morris, and he will do what I tell him.
And this had to be something singularly kind of funny or whatever for you to read, because of course you have put together a book of all Errol Morris interviews, and he hasn't changed his act. He didn't change his act because Harvey Weinstein said, "You got to give me one-liners." So, I mean, what was that like to see, this one of the most powerful men in movies, this letter from so long ago where he says, "Errol, quit it." But then what he was telling him to stop was the very substance of this book that's so enjoyable when it's all put together.
Well, I don't really actually, I don't necessarily see them as opposed. I mean, to a certain extent, Weinstein was certainly right, and that Errol would agree that he was right. I mean, you see over the course of his book, his style does evolve, and and I think that what Weinstein is doing is offering him, a very firm suggestion of a direction to go in, which doesn't necessarily mean that he has to dumb everything down, just that he has to be more savvy about selling his work and explaining it to people. And that is something that's really valid, and that is a continual struggle for him. I mean, it's difficult to explain some of the films to someone, and it's difficult to boil them down in a way that is saleable. I think that's a real concern. And in the instances where the films, if there's a reason why he's not better known, it's not impossible that it's related to that. That said, of course, he is who he is, and that's part of what attracts people to him, the ones who love him. So in that sense, or who admire him, in that sense, I think his audience is self-selecting and enjoy the way that he engages with the complications of his topics, to the extent that he does in such a complicated and profound way. I think in a way his audience, that's what they're looking for, and that's what they're up for. So by being himself, irrepressible self, he draws to him the people who are interested in his work, and that does preclude some, perhaps. But I think that Weinstein had a valid point, and that Errol would concede that point. And if you're interested and that letter is a great example of the candor and humor and outrageousness, to a certain extent, of Errol's words and of his communications. And, the book is just chock full of anecdotes like that and stories like that, which are hilarious and telling and revealing and really just a blast.
And finally, I'd like to ask about another theme that really jumped out at me having read the book. it's that Errol Morris, while he's funny and while he's produced all these fascinating films and TV as well, first person, which I really love, he's displayed such an intellectual curiosity, a fascination for his subjects. He even says a love for his subjects. At the same time, he doesn't stop referring to himself as misanthropic, as a pessimist. He says he quotes Sartre. He says, "Hell is other people. That's not going far enough." He quotes Kafka. "There's hope, but not for us." Perhaps he thinks that's not going far enough either. Do you believe him when he says he is such a misanthropic pessimist?
Not entirely, no. To a certain extent, yes, but not entirely. Even the way that he himself can be so thoughtful and charming and insightful, I think, is a testimony to the contrary.
And the work itself, it seems like a man who is allegedly so misanthropic, so pessimistic, couldn't make these movies, it seems to me.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point as well. I mean, even in his outstanding and just incredible interview with Lindy England, for instance, or Sabrina Harmon, those are very long interviews that are included in excerpt in the Film Standard Operating Procedure. Those interviews are so powerful that it's easy to imagine a film like The Fog of War made up of only one, focusing only on one subject. So, one of those women, for instance, his insistence on looking past the obvious, past the stereotypes, past deeper into what really happened and the context of what happened, and getting a full picture of where people were coming from, including those who have been vilified, perhaps especially those who have been vilified. It shows a remarkable compassion and interest and sense of shared humanity, I think, even with those who are really pariahs. I think that you're right that it's somewhat impossible for me to imagine. It's impossible for me to imagine that he could be such a good listener and not. Although he's interested in their motivations and in their lives and where they're coming from in a really deep way. He's not necessarily. In Standard Operating Procedure, his outrage at the way that the topic was handled by the media, by for instance, the way that the bad apples, as they're called, the soldiers, the MPs who were depicted in committing these horrible crimes in Abu Ghraib, these so-called torture photographs. He's really interested in the context in which that happened and putting it back into perspective. And in doing so, while he's not seeking to exonerate the perpetrators of the acts, he's also restoring them a level of humanity and granting them a level of humanity that is really unusual and that they hadn't previously been seen that way, or hadn't previously been granted by the press. And that's a film where I think you see his interest in politics merge with his interest in the individual, and in the individual who has committed something terrible, sort of an outlier to society. Those are people that he's often interested in over the long term. He's shown a really sustained interest in sort of social deviance and where that comes from. And the fine line that separates that from what's considered normal or acceptable in society. So I think there you see a lot of his themes coming into play. And it's interesting that in some of his films, they've had really mixed critical reception. That was a really difficult critical response, which was certainly not universally positive. But I think that it's also one other aspect of his films that I think is valuable is in that film, he's really providing, although the film has has very many of his, has many illustrations and has many sort of intrusions on the text itself, a text of the conversations. At the same time, what he's provided is a document of first, of primary source material that is something really valuable for American history and for the American people and for scholars of history and politics for years to come. So I think that there is an example where you see both his personal interest and a much larger political project coming together.
The book, once again, is Errol Morris Interviews. Livia Bloom, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the program.
It's a pleasure. Thanks so much for your interest, Colin.
This has been The Marketplace of Ideas. I've been Colin Marshall. You can find our complete interview archive at colinmarshallradio.com. And you can find the website of our theme music producer, Ben Althouse, at benalthouse.com. If you have any feedback, positive, negative, neutral, or otherwise, send that along to Colin at colinmarshallradio.com. Thank you for tuning in, and we will catch you next time.